Hello, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. Forgive me. I was having some challenges getting in the room. Okay, let's see. Can you hear me now, Dom? Dr. Robinson? Okay. All right, you can hear me now? Here we go. Can you guys hear me? Testing, testing. Not sure why I'm struggling now. We were good earlier. Reverend Gillian Fox, can you hear me? Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. So, welcome to Handling the Handoff. My name is Reverend Dr. Shareka Newton. I am currently serving as the executive pastor of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. I just recently completed my D-Min from Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And so, for the last 3 years, I have intensely studied. Pastoral transitions and what it really means to hand off a ministry from one senior leader to another senior leader. One of the beautiful things about picking up this work in the decision towards towards pursuing this work in this kind of scholarship is directly connected to my current context. And so the context I'm in is our church is a 140-year-old historically Black church in Brooklyn, New York. It's in an urban environment. We have a history of long tenured pastors. Our current pastor has been at Emmanuel for 31 years. I have served as the executive pastor there for 13 of those 31 years. And so, in the midst of walking with Pastor Trufant during, please don't entertain Dr. Robinson in the chat room, y'all. Uh, so, in the midst of walking with Pastor Trufant through his ministry, one of the things that became very evident was how quickly talks of transition erupt in churches. That there's always talk about transition and what's next and who's next, right? And so before we start off getting to actual church work, I just want to tell you guys an interesting story um, that I believe models what handling a handoff means. So in 2016, the US women's 4x100 Olympic team was disqualified from the finals qualifying round because Allison Felix was bumped. Allison Felix was the first runner in their relay. She was bumped by the Brazilian runner in the lane next to her. When she was bumped, she tripped and dropped the baton. When she tripped and dropped the baton, their team was in utter panic. But the person who was to run behind her in the second position, English Gardner, picked up the baton and kept running. Come on now. I don't know if there are any preachers in the room, but that right there goes all by itself. That English Gardner, even after the baton had been dropped, picked it up and continued to run with it. And they completed the marathon. They completed the relay as a team. One of the things that ended up happening, though, as a result of Allison Felix dropping the baton, was that the team was automatically disqualified. In the midst of them being disqualified after the race was over, and a reporter asked Gardner, why did she pick up the baton and keep on running, knowing that they were already disqualified? To which they responded to the reporter, the reason why they picked up the baton and kept on running was because in order to protest any type of disqualification, you have to finish the race. That in order to protest a disqualification, you have to finish the race. And so if you get discouraged because you dropped the baton or it wasn't a good handoff and you stop running, under no circumstances can you challenge the race. And so at the end, after it was over, even though they were disqualified, the US team decided to challenge the disqualification on the basis that Allison Felix was indeed bumped by another runner. After a review of the tape, they determined that because she was bumped, that did play a part in why she dropped the baton. And the U.S. women's Olympic team was given the opportunity to rerun their relay. Now, here's something that I think is worth mentioning, Reverend Fox. When they had to rerun the race, they had to rerun the race by themselves. So, in a relay, everybody runs together, but they had to just get a certain amount of time. They had to qualify just to beat whoever was in that final spot. And so they were on the track all by themselves. I don't know if any of you have ever run track, but it's hard to pace yourself without an opponent. And so they had to run this race completely by themselves. Their time came in just enough to beat China, who was at the bottom of the qualification rung for that first heat. They went on to win the gold medal that year in Rio in the 4x100 in the finals, all because they were not discouraged when the baton was dropped the initial time. Okay, where are you going with this, Reverend? One, I want to give each of you really good preaching fodder to go somewhere and do something with. So feel free to do the research about everything that happened at the 2016 Olympics and preach your heart out. But the further point for us in terms of connections regarding handling a handoff is one, the reason why they were able to win the gold in the end was because they were prepared in the beginning. Preparation means that they understood what the rules of the game were. They knew that even after the baton was dropped, that they were going to finish the race no matter what, because it could not be challenged, it could not be protested if they did not finish the race. So, yes, Chuck Williams, rule number one, never give up on yourself. But certainly you do not give up on yourself when you know that your only opportunity to win is connected to finally finishing, right? To meeting the finish line no matter what. Never give up on yourself, never give up on your team. Keep running even when the circumstances look like you've already lost. So when we start talking about this whole idea of the 2016 Olympics brings me to this idea of something I learned when I was reading Passing the Leadership Baton, a book by Tom Mullins. In Tom Mullins' book, he offers that the first of his 11 tips for handing a baton off well in terms of pastoral ministry is make the tough calls before the exchange. Make the tough calls before the exchange. That means plan, plan, plan. We don't always do that in our churches. Plan, plan, plan. But then, in according to the Elephant in the Boardroom by Carolyn Weiss and J. Russell Crabtree, a healthy pastoral transition is one that enables a church to move forward into the next phase of its external and internal development with a new leader appropriate to those developmental tasks and with a minimum of spiritual, hear me, programmatic material and people losses during the transition. The focus should be on preserving the spiritual programmatic material and people resources as much as possible during the transition, right? But I want to be clear to you that my focus in the midst of discussing with you all how to hand off the baton, if you would, well, is not just about how to not kill the church from one pastor to another, but it's about healthy transitions. I think one of the things that we don't focus on enough when it comes to church leadership transitions is how do we do it in such a way where all three parties that are impacted are healthy? What do you mean by all three parties, Dr. Newton? I mean, one, the outgoing pastor, the incoming pastor, and the congregation, that all three entities really can come out on the other side healthy, right? After a pastor has been at a church for a while, how can they leave and be healthy when they go elsewhere? How do we create an environment where a new pastor can be ushered in and invited in a way that honors the history of the church and the impact of the previous pastor, but at the same time leaves room for them to develop vision and set vision for themselves, as well as is there room and space given and created for the congregation to grieve? Right? Come on, grieve. Anybody who's ever been at a church in the midst of a pastoral transition knows that whether they was ready for the pastor to go or not, churches grieve a pastor leaving. And so that is something that we have to be mindful of, right? But all of this research really comes from an experience I had at a conference years ago. I think at this point it may have been 2, 3 years ago. I went to a conference called IC3. What was the name of the elephant book? It's The Elephant in the Boardroom by Carolyn Weiss and J. Russell Crabtree. Thank you, Dr. Robinson, for that. The Elephant in the Boardroom. Okay, so I went to a conference called the IC3 conference, which is hosted by Church Without Walls. And at that conference, they have a segment called Story Time. In the midst of Story Time, a well-known woman pastor gets up, co-pastor at the time, and she begins to tell the story of her church. She had been at her church for 30 plus years. She and her husband had been co-pastoring there. They had birthed their children, raised their children, reared their children in this church, and now all their children are grown, and even their grandchild is grown. They have grown the church by leaps and bounds. They are well known. As the woman is talking, she begins to speak about how leading the church not simply was a great experience for the church and the impact that they had on the church, but the impact that the church had had on she and her family. How the life of her family and herself was so entwined with the church that she was mentioning she did not even know what her life would look like once it was time for them to move on. There was a point where, she talked about the fact that her husband was no longer doing well, and he was sick, and he could no longer help and serve alongside of her the way they had partnered in ministry together for so long. And there's a moment where she begins to softly break down, and she says, "I'm all by myself now, y'all. I'm all by myself." And you can feel the tension in the crowd, and just the weight and the seriousness of the moment weighing on this room of preachers and pastors. And then she says, "And because my denomination does not value transition plans, I don't even know what's going to happen to the ministry that I've spent the last 30 plus years growing and developing." In that moment, it occurred to me that if you really love a place, you are concerned about not simply what happens during your tenure, but far beyond your tenure, right? So like I have 2 sons. I absolutely love my sons. I think they're adorable. I'm not just concerned with them when they were in my household. They are now 23 and 24, and so I'm glad that they no longer live here. Bless God. Anyway. But the fact that they no longer live at home does not mean that I am no longer concerned about their well-being, that I'm no longer concerned about their development. I still want to see them thrive and do well, even if I don't get the credit for it, right? Like, even if I have to say, well, they're adults on their own now. Other people have poured into them. Other people have loved on them. Other people have guided them. I still want them to do well, regardless of whether or not I get the credit. And I think this is really what it comes down to when we think about transitions, right? So first, let's talk about this. Transitions happen for a number of different reasons. If you're in the chat room, what are some reasons why a senior pastor transitions away from a ministry? Come on, help me out. Just a couple of people. So, a new call. Yes, Dr. Robinson. Time to retire. Yes. Time to retire. Come on, there's other people in here. Age or illness. Yes. Death. Church hurt. Come on here. Pastor Youngblood. Church hurt. Yes. People leave churches for a myriad of different reasons. The congregation is sick of them. Yes, some folks get put out. Some folks leave voluntarily. Some people shift and transition away from ministry. They tired of this church, like that little boy. They don't want to do church ministry, parish ministry anymore. They're sick. Scandals. Come on now here. We all know back talk about why so-and-so really left. People leave for scandals. They leave because it's time for retirement. They leave because of illness, because of death, because of church hurt, because of career shifts, relocation for other obligations. Yes. Money reasons. Yes. Come on. Now, Pastor Youngblood is helping us to move into one of the things that is really crucial. Thank you for bringing up money reasons. A lot of pastors not just leave for money reasons, but stay. So that's something that we're going to come back to, because that is a part of handling the handoff well, addressing some of the reasons why people don't transition when they're supposed to be, right? So here's the deal. There should be a plan in place before the transition period is entered into, before the catalyst for the transition is activated. So all of the reasons that we just cited are the possible catalysts for transitions. What I am suggesting is that a transition plan needs to be in place long before any of those things ever happen. Denomination slash tradition no longer line up with theological passions or convictions. Oh, that's real. Some people don't stay because they no longer can ethically back the traditions reinforced by theological structures that are no longer aligned with their beliefs and what they have grown to learn in their continued studies. Okay, great. However, this is something I'm about to say that is going to shock you guys. It's going to blow your mind. And some of you may not agree with me. You may think I sound crazy. But I stand by this. I believe it is crucial. If you are a new pastor, if we have any new pastors, you've been pastoring for 5 years or less in the chat room, shout out to you. Throw something up in the chat room so I know that you're in here. If you've been pastoring for 5 years or less somewhere, let me know. You should, yes, Reverend Fox, you should have a transition plan in place within your first year of ministry at a church. I know that sounds absolutely crazy. People are like, why in the world would I start planning my transition when I just got here? Why would I put in the minds of my members that I might possibly leave? I don't want to do that. I don't want nobody thinking about me leaving. I just got here. I'm the senior pastor. I'm going to stay forever. Here's the deal. Any parents in the chat room? Yes, Dr. Robinson, you count. Any parents in the chat room? Self-identify. Come on, real quick. Yes. Okay. Here we go. So any parent will tell you, even if they did not have life insurance before they became a parent, the minute they had that baby, your mindset shifts and change to this idea of, I love this little human so much that I need to make preparations for them if something happens to me, right? Come on, parents, I need a cosign here. Somebody knows you was young and dumb. You ain't had no insurance, you ain't had no will. But the minute them kids came, it shifts everything. Why? Because now you are of a mindset that I need to prepare a place for these people I care about so much, so that if something happens to me, they are still okay. My kids had all kind of insurance in the event that something happened to me. I was very clear. They still need to be able to go to college. They need to be able to live in the home that I've raised them in without any fear that they're going to lose their parent, their primary parent, and then all of a sudden not be able to go to college, not be able to live the same quality of life, right? So when I was doing my doctoral work, I worked with 3 pastors primarily. The 3 pastors that I worked with primarily are my current senior pastor. His name is Reverend Anthony L. Trufant, Reverend Dr. Gina Marcia Stewart, who's the senior pastor of Christ Missionary Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, and Reverend Reginald Sharp, who's the senior pastor of Christ of help me, Lord Jesus, is the senior pastor of, why is it Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know why I lost fellowship for a minute. So I worked with the 3 of them. And out of the 3 of them, as we were going through this work and interviewing them and answering certain questions, the newest pastor was the only one who had a transition in plan as soon as he started. And so right now, he hasn't even been installed in the church officially. His installation is coming up very shortly because it was delayed due to the pandemic. However, Dr. Sharp, Reverend Sharp, they already have a transition plan in place. God forbid in a million years, but if something happens to Reggie in the next 5 years, Fellowship Chicago knows exactly what it is that they are going to do. When discussing this with longer tenured pastors, Pastor Trufant and Dr. Stewart, they were appalled by the idea of this. Now, here's the challenge based on my research. Everything in the scholarship says, though it may be difficult for you to imagine yourself having to leave your ministry context, your love for the ministry and your commitment to the growth and discipleship of the people should mandate a preparation plan that the people in the community that you have helped to foster and grow will be okay whether you are there or not. Right? So handling the handoff, the first step really does mean that you have to start your tenure off with a mindset that you will not be there forever. And that is very difficult a lot of times for us in full-time ministry. So here we go. In the chat room, I need you guys to answer. Ham or eggs? It's breakfast. We going to brunch after the good church house? Come on. Ham or eggs? Which one are you? Ham or eggs? Okay. Dr. Robinson says she's eggs. And a good Bellini. Okay. Chuck Williams says ham. Good. Reverend Fox, ham. Come on. Come on. Come on. It's a couple more y'all in here. Don't be voyeurs. Just put it in the chat room for me real quick. Ham or eggs? One more person. If I say bacon, does that count? Okay, Harry James, ham. Here we go. Ham or eggs. My favorite television show is Grey's Anatomy. On Grey's Anatomy, there's an episode where a young married couple comes in. They were actually engaged. A young engaged couple comes in. The woman is pregnant. She has twins. Her fiance explains to the doctor, there's a point in life where you have to decide who you are, whether you are ham or eggs. George doesn't understand what he's saying. He's like, I don't get it, ham or eggs. He says, look, check this out. When you're making breakfast, in order to get ham, the pig has to be fully committed, whereas to get eggs, the chicken just makes a contribution. So we each have to decide when it comes to ministry, whether we are ham or whether we are eggs, whether we are fully committed or we're just willing to make a contribution. And so here we go. Whether you are fully committed or willing to make a contribution. When I'm talking about a healthy handoff, transition of leadership, shift in power and authority, ham or eggs is a question that I believe both the church, the outgoing pastor, and the incoming pastor have to make. And when it comes to the church as an institution has to be willing to be ham. If the church is not fully committed to a healthy transition of leadership, then ultimately someone is going to be injured in the process. What are you talking about? I'm going to just say this point blank period. The recommendations that I believe are crucial for a healthy handoff require that a church be willing to make a financial commitment to the wellness of its leadership. Be willing to make a financial commitment to the wellness of its leadership. And here we go. One, the church needs to prepare itself for both grief and excited anticipation. Come on, y'all. Grief and excited anticipation. One of the things that is problematic is that we do not acknowledge and honor that in areas of our life that are not familial bonds, we don't honor grief properly. Okay. I think this is really a dynamic point for many of us who are pastors, preachers, work in any capacity in terms of ministry, because when we do not acknowledge that grief exists in other realms of our lives, we do not give people the permission to honor their grief and to process their grief and to deal with their grief so they can move through to the other side of awareness that possibilities for healing, wholeness, and happiness still exist for them, right? Even if you don't like a pastor, okay? There was a minister at Emmanuel when I was growing up. Y'all, when I tell you, still now, I am fully grown. I do not believe that this woman knew Jesus. No, I just don't. In my mind, she was still like a gremlin that used to eat and abduct children, right? This woman was mean as the day is long. But when she died, I stood in the receiving line in the parlor of the church and wept like a baby. You'd have thought that my mama's best friend auntie had died. I wept. I was devastated. My eyes was puffy and swollen. And it was not until I was given the space by my parents to acknowledge my grief, that I was able to process that though I did not like this woman, though I never felt safe or cared for by her, though she never poured anything into me that I felt like put me on a guiding path through life, what she had been for me was consistent. Yes, she had been consistent, that she had been around my entire life. She was a staple in the church. She was a fixed fixture. When I came in and out of the building, I saw her every day. I had to greet her every day. And so here's the deal: whether or not the church loves the outgoing pastor, they will still grieve the loss of that pastor before and during the new pastor's tenure. That there's still a bit of separation anxiety. Come on here, look at the nails. Oh, there's a bit of separation anxiety in the fact that, hey, we all know what this devil is. It's that old moniker, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. And so there will be a level of grief. That's not how Pastor so and so used to do it. That's not what Pastor so and so said. That's not how Pastor so and so used to celebrate their anniversary. That's not what Pastor so and so, how they told us to do it, right? And so there are a lot of challenges for the incoming pastor when a congregation has not been given the room and space to grieve. So what does that look like? It means planning celebrations. We need to be just as good as saying goodbye sometimes as we are as saying hello and installing pastors. And frequently that is not the case, particularly in many African American church contexts, right? And so as a part of this grief, I believe we need to build in celebrations that honor the past, that honor the legacy and the contribution of the outgoing pastor. With that being said, there also needs to be a line that points directly to the new place we're going and encourages us to remember that joy is still on the way, right? That growth is still on the way, that a deeper relationship with God is still about to be our portion because of the vision that is going to be set from the new pastor. There ought to be some enthusiasm about the anticipation of what's about to be introduced to the ministry and the new ways that we'll be able to experience God because of the new person that's coming in the vision that they will set. And so when we think about this, for me, my why about why I'm about to make the recommendations I'm going to present to you all regarding implementing a healthy pastoral transition is connected to my current context. So, in my current context, like I said earlier, our senior pastor has been the senior pastor for 31 years. He also has the privilege of being my godfather. And so, not my godfather in the sense of how many of us do godparents. They stand up at the church house, and your kid don't see him again until high school graduation. No, I had a very close and intimate relationship with my godparents growing up. At one point, I even lived in their home for a period of time. And so for me, the why is watching my godfather be obsessed with the work of the church and the work of the ministry, oftentimes to the detriment of his own health, his own family, and his own personal relationships, right? That even he, in the midst of allowing me to interview him and profile him for my doctoral work, even he had to acknowledge that in many instances, he unconsciously displayed behavior that made it appear that the church was his primary focus and responsibility, that it was his primary thing, that he loved going to the church. During the pandemic, over the last 15, 16 months, when we were shut down, our church was closed. We have not returned to in-person worship yet. He was at the church every single day. Um, I believe wholeheartedly that that says something. He is somebody who admittedly, publicly, he allowed me to write about it, so I'm not revealing anything personal about him without permission, has struggled with seasonal affective disorder, SAD, a severe form of depression that manifests at different points during the year. That one of the ways he chose, or has one of the tools he's used to combat his depression, is to throw and immerse himself in work. That work gives him a reason to keep going when otherwise his body chemistry and genetic makeup would make him want to lay in the bed, put the covers over his head, and never come out again. In the midst of that, one of the things that I've realized is that we do not always uh, implore our pastors to be healthy for themselves. Come on here, the pastors in the chat room, you are in the group. Come on, tell the truth, shame the devil. That we frequently put the needs of our members and of our church as a whole above our own. And as a result, clergy death tolls are getting higher and higher due to avoidable illnesses, blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, being overweight, because we have poor self-care habits in an attempt to grow the church numerically and spiritually, right? So I'm not just saying, oh, we about the numbers and the money. No, that sometimes we are so focused on the growth of other people. Oh, that we got to make them disciples. They got to know the word. Yes, and the Bible says, come on here, that God took a Sabbath, that even God rested. And so one of the things I will say about um, what it means to handle a handoff well is to start the handoff with the idea that self-care is a priority for the pastors, for both the outgoing pastor and the incoming pastor. And so here's where we start. I want to start with an outgoing pastor again. This is about, this is a plan for what I would hope a church would have already been doing, but that before the actual handoff happens, hopefully with this format, we are estimating that you have about a 12 to 18 month period of time before the handoff that you know what's coming, right? Clearly, this is very different if the pastor just drops dead, which then means we just move on to the focus regarding the congregation. But one, that from a 12 to 18 month out period, that the church would set up a financial planner for the outgoing pastor. One of the most egregious things that came up in my research was that so many senior pastors stay and delay retirement because they cannot afford to retire. Come on here, somebody, that they stay because they cannot afford to retire. Now, if your senior pastor stays and delays retirement because they cannot financially afford to retire, I'm going to tell you now, the church cannot afford to keep them, because somebody whose primary motivation is financial is not somebody who is also deeply in tune with vision. And so the church needs to set up a financial planner to work with that pastor, to get them prepared, not simply for retirement, if that's the reason for the transition, but for the next stage of life, right? The second thing is a life coach. Why do you need a life coach, Pastor? I'm a pastor. I don't need no life coach. Maybe I have a discernment coach or something like that. I don't need no life coach. No, 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 no. Hear me. If you are leaving the church because you are retiring, or because you are seeking a different path outside of ministry, then what a life coach does is really help you to tap into what your new and next passions are. What will you do next that will have a meaningful impact on your life? The reason why pastors overstay their welcome at churches and ultimately end up killing churches that were once successful and thriving is because they don't know what they would do outside of ministry. And I don't know about you all, but I don't want to do ministry because I feel like I can't do something else, right? That God has put a multitude of giftings within each of us that I'd like to think has a lot of crossover into different pathways and different movements in the world. And so, but if you can't figure out what to do next, then what happens is, and you guys can look into this. Yes, Pastor Williams, everything has a season. But if we cannot help retiring, outgoing pastors shifting and transitioning into other career fields, recognize and identify their passions, then what we find is depression rates go skyrocketing for pastors. Pastors who leave ministries without knowing where they're going to land experience an exponentially higher rate of depression and mental health disorders than one might think is even possible. And so the life coach. And the next thing is this: a therapist. I need somebody who has a therapist, knows a therapist, believes in a therapist to put amen in the chat roll. A therapist is the will of God concerning you. Had a conversation last night with a good friend, and we that ended up, come on here. I can't get one amen to a therapist in the chat room. I'm concerned about y'all, Dr. Robinson. I know you got an amen. That certainly some of us know that a therapist is the will of God. So last night I was talking to this friend, and one of the things that we discussed was it is a poor doctor that has himself for a patient, right? If you think that you can treat yourself, you can diagnose yourself, you can pastoral care yourself, I promise you that you yourself will be unhealthy. That each of us needs to have somebody who can help us to process the things that we are feeling, that we are dealing with, that we are going through, particularly when it comes to pastoral and church ministry. I believe that it was Miss Youngblood who put in the chat roll earlier regarding church hurt. Pastors, ministers, church workers do not leave parish environments unscathed. Why? Because church folks think they have the same past as little old ladies, that they think they have gotten to the point where they could say whatever they want to say to the pastor and the ministers. Ooh, pastor, you sure is putting on some weight. You getting fat there. Oh, that's what you want to eat? Oh, the pastor shouldn't have worn that suit. That one don't fit him well. Oh, what's she doing with that dress on? She need a lap skirt for sure with that dress. That church folks, um, I'm not that pastor. Come on, I hope not. I don't want to be that pastor either. But there are legit pastors who fight off therapy and in the end find that they are doing themselves more harm than good, because we are even at the best churches, guys. I hope we can be honest about this. Even at the best churches, um, church folks is crazy. Don't matter where you live, don't matter your demographic, racially, don't matter socioeconomic status, whether they rich, whether they poor, whether it's urban, whether it's rural, whether they're black, whether they're white. Church folks are crazy. And when I say crazy, I mean they violate all kind of boundaries when it comes to pastors. And if we don't establish boundaries for them, then ultimately they won't know how to operate with us. So the next move, when we start talking about healthy pastoral transitions, has to do with the congregation, right? So I said this earlier. The congregation has to be given intentional. Hear the word, Dr. Robinson, if you could type intentional in all capital letters for me in the chat roll. Intentional opportunities to grieve and celebrate new beginnings. That it has to be both, that we need a space where we can say goodbye to what was while we also celebrate new beginnings, right? So for me, one of the most interesting things of my life was my oldest son graduating from high school. When he graduated from high school, for our family, it was a huge, momentous occasion, because the same year he graduated from high school was the same year he became a father. Amen. Because I told my sons to uh, live holy or be safe, and he chose neither. So I am a grandma. But the beautiful thing when I say grieve and celebrate is that we grieve the fact that uh, his high school experience and his graduation and going off to college was not what we as a family had acknowledged. I mean, what we as a family had anticipated. It's not what we thought things were going to look like, but we celebrated the new beginning because, hey, I thought that when we took family pictures, it would be my two sons, my parents, siblings, and, my son just in the middle being celebrated. But in turn, what we got were some amazing pictures of my grandson wearing his father's cap at graduation, and my grandson sitting in his car seat at graduation, dressed up, waiting to clap for his daddy. We got pictures that my father took and video that my father took of my grandson Chase clapping hysterically when they called his dad's name. He was only 6 months old. He didn't know that they were calling his dad's name. He simply knew that he was clapping because everybody else was clapping. But what does that celebration mean? For our family, that celebration meant that though things were not the way we anticipated, things were still good. And so when we start talking about congregational, that is the opportunity that a congregation intentionally has to be given, an opportunity to both grieve the loss of what they hoped would be, and an opportunity to celebrate what can be. The next thing is to focus on continuing seamless programmatic ministry. One of the things that happens far too often in congregations during a transition is that people let ministry work fall to the wayside. And the idea is when the new pastor comes, they'll pick it up. They'll put something back in place. They'll reinstate so and so ministry. No, if right now you all have a thriving food pantry, the thriving food pantry can't get shut down for the 6 months that the transition takes. If there is a thriving after school program, tutoring program, sports program, whatever it is that you all are doing at your fabulous ministries, the work of the ministry must keep going. Hear me, guys. The work of the ministry must keep going. The reason, based on research, that churches do well during transitions is not because of the preaching. It's not because giving stayed up. All of the research points to the fact that members stay at churches even during difficult transitions, even during scandals, if the ministry of the church continues, if we still go out and serve, if we still are baptizing believers, if we're still doing weekly Bible study, Sunday school, children's church, will the work of the ministry continue? That is important. Yes, the ministry of the church must continue. Uh, the last thing is this: vibrant worship. Yeah, vibrant worship. No one wants to stay at a church where once the senior pastor begins to transition, there is a decline in the worship, right? If we make an announcement this week that, oh, this is going to be the beginning of the countdown to say goodbye to our senior pastor, the people them don't want all of a sudden for it to be the chancel choir every single weekend. The chancel choir, historically at our church, people got the older saints, the senior saints, who have a more of a operatic flair, if you would, right? And so, no, there still needs to be vibrant, engaging worship, whatever your denomination is, whatever your worship style is, whether demonstrative, whether contemplative. Worship needs to be vibrant and as engaging as possible for people to remain active in the congregation during a transition. Now, this next thing is for the incoming senior pastor, and it's almost the same exact thing as what we did for the outgoing pastor in that 12 to 18-month period. But we want to start off equipping the incoming senior pastor with some things. The first thing we want to equip the incoming senior pastor with, if they don't already have one, is a therapist. We've already said that therapy is the will of God. And so, because we know that they are taking on something where now they're not only going to have to balance out their issues and their personal struggles, but also the baggage of not being the previous pastor, right? So here I am coming in, and the people love me, and they voted for me, and they clapped for me, and they cheered for me, and they installed me. But they're also going to remind me for the next 5 years that I'm not Pastor so and so. And I need some place where I can be angry about that and say, these Negroes don't even appreciate me properly. And it can't be to somebody in the congregation. And so you need a therapist. The other thing at the beginning of the incoming senior pastor's tenure that we connect them with, I told you it's like the same thing for the outgoing pastor, but backwards, is a financial planner. We want to start the senior pastor off from a place of financial health, fiscal health. Far too often, pastors feel like they are wrong if they advocate for their own finances. But the Bible says that a worker is worth their wages. And so, with that being said, a church that is truly concerned about the overall health of their pastor wants them to also be healthy financially. I think it is a myth of church of old where the pastor has to be a pauper. That is not even biblically based. It certainly does not come from Jesus. And so we don't need to be of a mindset that we have to be suffering and going without in order to lead people, right? And so we want to connect the incoming pastor with a financial planner. But the next thing that we want to connect them with is a trainer and dietitian. I mean, like a physical trainer, like you must get pumped, and a dietitian. The average incoming senior pastor is going to gain like somewhere in the neighborhood between 10 and 20 pounds in the first 3 years of ministry. What? Doesn't matter how old you are based on the research, between 10 to 20 pounds. That is egregious. What do you mean? I've been the same exact weight for the last 7 years. Now I done came to this church, and because I am what? Not doing effective self-care. I am now eating things I didn't used to eat because I'm stress eating. I'm not taking the time out to care for myself. I'm not sleeping the same. And as a result, it begins to put on pounds. In the Based on that weight gain, we now begin to see senior pastors having health challenges and health issues that ultimately impact the way that they are able to help grow the church, right? And so, because of that, we really have to be mindful of it. I'm pretty much done right here. We're at the 151 mark. Does anybody have any questions? Any thoughts you want to put out there? If not, then I will give you guys your 9 minutes back and you can have a break until the next session at 2. But I want to thank you guys for participating. Come on, Reverend Horton, what's your question, sir? Certainly, I am welcoming it. I want to thank each of you who participated in the chat room and just for the engagement, just for sticking with me for the time that has been ours. Reverend Horton, what's your question, sir? And I also want to thank you, Reverend Horton, for your assistance typing in. Should the outgoing pastor have the responsibility to tell the incoming pastor the truth about the climate of the church? Here we go, Reverend Horton. The answer is, I believe, yes. Based on my research, based on just even my dissertation and the work that I've continued to do in this field, the answer is any level of overlap that a incoming pastor gets to have with an outgoing pastor, even if their interaction is not good, even if their interaction is not healthy, any level of overlap between them has proven percentage wise to lead to a healthier transition. Healthier transition based on, remember what we talked about in the beginning, the retention of people, the retention of programs, the retention of resources. And so I believe that you have the responsibility to a certain extent to share institutional knowledge. Come on, y'all, with the language. Institutional knowledge. And with institutional knowledge is the truth of what your experience has been. Now, with that being said, I also believe that an incoming pastor has to take those things with a grain of salt because your experience ain't my experience. And the truth of the matter is, they just might not have liked Reverend Horton, but Reverend Newton came in and they love me, boo. So yes, I believe that the pastor has a responsibility to share that information, right? When my sons were younger and I was going away and I would drop them off with their godmother, when I dropped them off, I said, hey, I put Q's eczema cream in the book bag, and Brandell has a math test on Monday, so he really needs to be spending some time studying this weekend, right? I gave her the information that she needed to take care of them well. And so I believe that's what that information sharing should look like, Reverend Horton. Anybody else? Any other questions? You're welcome, sir. You're welcome. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to share with you all today. I pray that each of you will indeed be able to make a positive contribution to any leadership transition that you are a part of in the future. You are the bomb as well, Reverend Horton. Thank you for jumping in and being our virtual assistant at the spur of the moment. And so we thank God for you and for Dr. Robinson for tapping you. And so thank you, Reverend Fox, and thank you, Miss Youngblood. You guys have definitely been a blessing to me as well. And so have a great day, everybody, and you now have the next 6 minutes to breathe until the next session starts. Bye bye.